Hey guys, hope you had a good Christmas break. You should have already completed your bell ringer on Google Classroom. You are going to fill in your guided notes now, listen to the lecture, then you will have some questions to answer on your exit slip, and then review questions at the end of class. So keep up and pay attention. We are going to answer questions as we go through the lecture. Rather than doing it on Nearpod, you're just going to write the answers on the back of your notes, and you're going to turn your notes in at the end of class for participation points. Alright, so today we will start with Chapter 10, The Roaring Twenties, and we'll talk about how life is changing during that decade. So, lots of changes. Today we're going to focus on the social changes of the 20s. Like I said, please fill in your notes as we go. You might want to get a highlighter out. If I go too fast, it's because we only have a 15 time limit on this program. So just pause it, go back, get your notes filled in, and then move on. Alright, so first we'll start talking about women. We already talked about the 19th Amendment and how that gave women the right to vote. So I want you to highlight that first bullet because that is probably the most important or most significant new role for women of the 20s. Alright, in general though, they did vote just as much as the men in their lives did, and usually voted how the men voted in their lives. They had taken a lot of jobs during World War I, but we know when the men came home, the men replaced the women in most cases, and those women became unemployed. In the 20s, they are joining the workforce again in large numbers, but for the lowest paying jobs. And we start to see women go to college. So, flip your notes over there on the back and put number 1. Your first question says, this blank gave full voting rights to women. All I want you to do is write A, B, C, or D. So number 1, write A, B, C, or D. And then flip your notes back over. Alright, now, the 20s are also going to bring a shift in the attitude towards men and women's relationships. Basic rules of defining women's behavior is going to start to change. We'll start to see, a new type of kind of women emerge during the 20s. They did continue to have that primary responsibility for caring for the home and the children, but it's going to change a little bit when women start fighting for equality. So you have the flapper, which you see here on the image on your right. This was one of the popular images that reflected changes for women in the Roaring 20s. The flapper was suggested to be an independent, free lifestyle, and most women that took part in this flapper lifestyle were young, rebellious girls. Okay, flappers were women who would cut their hair, raise their hemline, they wore makeup, they smoked, they drank, and they started dancing. And so this was much, much different than the role of the women at the time or any time before. So it was kind of shocking the nation, and it wasn't accepted by all. Most of the flappers lived in the cities because that's where the party scene was. Rural women, however, did know about the flappers. They read about flappers in magazines and things like that. They just did not have the nightlife that the ladies in the city did. Alright. A lot of women disagreed with the lifestyle of the flappers. They said they were just out to have fun rather than interested in fighting for women's equality. A lot of people didn't take the flappers serious. This craze took hold mainly in the cities, like I said, where the nightlife was, but the flappers represented that kind of change or that conflict between cities and rural areas. And so we will talk about that conflict in just a second. But know there's a difference, know they're separated, and there's a little conflict between the two. Okay, flip your notes back over. Your second question for today, and all you're going to write down is number 2 and A, B, C, or D. So, blank or a segment of society who were more likely to adopt the dress and manner exhibited by flappers. Is it A, feminist, B, grandmothers, C, African Americans, or D, rebellious girls? So who in that group is going to become a flapper? And just write on your paper A, B, C, or D. Alright, flip your paper back over. And we're going to talk about urbanization very briefly here. The 20s was a great time of economic opportunity. A lot of people are making a lot of money. The economy is soaring. We call it, the boom years or the roaring 20s. But we already know that a lot of people are not prospering, and that major group is farming. Farming took a hard hit after World War I. We know that their prices for their goods went down, and also the demand for the goods. They're not selling as much farm products. They're not getting as much money for those. And for the first time, we start to see more people living in cities than in rural areas. 3/4 of all workers work somewhere other than a farm. So this is going to be a huge change from what we know in history here in the 20s. And the rise of the automobile made that possible because you could now, live in the rural places. You could move to the cities. Rural people were now more likely to spend more time in the cities because they could drive back and forth. Education is going to increase. They're going to pass laws requiring children to go to school, and this is going to take a lot of children out of the workforce, and then it's going to put them in school. So school attendance and enrollment is going to increase. Alright, but like I said, there's going to be a conflict between your cities and your rural areas. Americans are going to live in larger communities, which are going to produce a shift in values. So I want you to highlight that first bullet because that is your vocab term, one of them. Many people in urban areas had values that were very different from those of the rural areas. And I want you to highlight these two dashes here that start with rural and city because this outlines what those values are. So rural Americans represented the traditional spirit of hard work, self-reliance, religion, and independence, and cities are going to represent the change of those values. Okay, we still see the Ku Klux Klan taking members in the 20s and growing. Many of their members were from rural areas. They are going to focus on influencing politics in the 20s. And they were still mostly in the South, but they had spread nationwide like we talked about before. Their membership was in the millions at one point. It's going to decline in the 20s because you see scandals of the leaders, of the Klan leaders during this time. That causes, members to leave. All right. Next person we're going to talk about is Billy Sunday. He was a fundamentalist preacher that had been a baseball player. So and when we say the term fundamentalism, we mean a literal translation of the Bible. So I want you to highlight that last bullet because that is a vocab term that will be on your quiz. Fundamentalism is a strict belief or a literal interpretation of the Bible. Alright. And there was a huge increase in turning to religion because of all of the changes. The changing caused uncertainty, and so many people turned to religion to find different answers. Billy Sunday, like I said, was a preacher who was going to give those answers. McPherson was also a leading fundamentalist preacher of the time. And she seemed to embrace the kind of glamour that other fundamentalists worried about, so she was a little bit different, but she still believed in that strict interpretation of the Bible. And she was well known for healing the sick through prayer. So highlight Billy Sunday's name and highlight McPherson's name. Alright, the next thing we're going to talk about is kind of a conflict between evolution and fundamentalism. So if you remember us talking about evolution, you know that is Darwin's idea. I'm going to pause this and go turn the lights back on. Alright, So the Scopes trial had to deal with, like I said, a conflict between evolution and fundamentalism. And I want you to write that up beside the heading right here. I want you to put conflict between evolution and fundamentalism. So evolution said that that was Darwin's idea that said our population had changed over generations and we had actually evolved from an ape-like species. Fundamentalists argued with this and said that conflicted with the Bible's account of how God created humans and the earth. So there was actually laws that were passed that said you could not teach evolution in schools, which you guys probably all learned about evolution in biology class. In the 1920s, you could not do this. So there's a group in Tennessee that fought to teach evolution in schools, and they persuaded John Scopes, who was a young science teacher, to teach evolution in his science class. He was arrested, and he went to trial. He was represented by Clarence Darrow. Now, I want you to highlight this bullet here that says Scopes was represented by Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, right here. Because I want you to know who the defending attorney was and who the prosecuting attorney was. So, Clarence Darrow defended John Scopes. He fought for him. William Jennings Bryan was the prosecuting attorney, so he fought against him. He prosecuted him. Alright, so Scopes was obviously guilty. He did teach that in his class, but this case was about so much more. And that was the conflict between evolution and fundamentalists. He was convicted and fined $100, and the law remained in place that you could not teach evolution in schools until about the 60s. Alright, so Scopes trial is definitely something I want you to remember, so go ahead and highlight that top heading here, and you can highlight what you wrote into about the conflict of fundamentalist and evolutionists. Alright, so your next question, you can go ahead and flip your notes over on the back. Write number 3. The most controversial of Darwin's idea is known as A, fundamentalism, B, values, C, evolution, or D, stability. So who is Darwin and what was his idea? Alright, we're going to go pretty quickly through these last few slides because we only have a few minutes left. Prohibition, good. We'll go over this real quick because we've already talked about it. You guys already know about it. For years in U.S. history, people tried to fight alcohol. They tried to make it illegal. They thought it led to violence, abuse in homes, things like that, poverty. But they did pass the 18th Amendment, which instated prohibition and made it illegal, banned alcohol, and that was ratified in 1919. Okay, the Volstead Act was passed to enforce the amendment, which just gave police authority to enforce the ban on alcohol. So I want you to highlight the last bullet, and I want you to know that the 18th Amendment goes with prohibition. Okay. Prohibition in practice, of course, you have people trying to get around the law. It proved to be virtually impossible to enforce that new prohibition law. It gave rise to huge smuggling operations and huge criminal empires. So you see bootleggers, or liquor smugglers start to rise. Many criminals made their empire around prohibition. And one we know specifically, we talked about before Christmas break, was Al Capone. Alright, the illegal liquor business was the foundation of those empires, okay, like Al Capone's empire. You had 3,000 prohibition agents nationwide working to shut down what they call speakeasies, and I want you to highlight that second to last bullet. Speakeasies were illegal bars that they would serve alcohol to guests and things like that. Millions of Americans violated this laws, but it would be many years before prohibition came to an end. And that was when it was repealed with the 21st Amendment. Alright, and your last question here. The Volstead Act was passed to enforce A, fundamentalism, B, the 18th Amendment, C, women's rights, or D, the Harlem Renaissance. Alright, that's your last question. All your notes should be filled in. You should have your questions on the back of your notes. You are going to turn these into the box so that you get credit for filling them in. And your questions are going to be graded. Alright, now go to Google Classroom and finish your classwork. See you guys tomorrow.